Hello, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be in this discussion featuring Sriram, featuring Dr. Pillai and Dr. Deodhar. The discussion for the next 1 hour, including the question and answer sessions from the audience, is regarding this absolutely wonderful book called Kautilyanomics. This is by my very good friend Sriram Balasubramanian, who is an acclaimed economist. And right now, except for the three of us, he is present in America at an unearthly hour, which is possibly sometime in very early morning. Hello to you, Sri, and hello to Dr. Pillai and Dr. Dev.
Hello.
Namaste.
Hello,
Namaste
sir.
to all.
Namaste.
Wonderful having all three of you. And Sri, it's a bit of a pleasure being involved in launching your book because the questions are many and time is severely limited. I have a range of about 7 or 8 questions, but the way I've structured this is I'll ask a couple of questions to you. I'll give you ample time, plus 30 seconds to answer those questions, and I'll move on to any comments and questions that Dr. Deodhar and Dr. Pillai would have of their own. And then we'll come round, possibly finish 2 or 3 cycles, and then leave enough time for the questions that the audiences will have. So let me kick off straight away without much ado about asking you the real motivation behind this book. And the fact is that why there are only a couple of books regarding this subject, Sri, about Kautilya and economics. And what was the real trigger for this book? And why, if I may, because I know a little bit of secrets of this, why it's taken you 5 years to write this book?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks a lot, Anand. Really appreciate you coordinating and coming to this event. Thanks to Satish, Professor Deodhar, and Dr. Radhakrishnan Pillai as well. These are all experts who worked in Kautilya for a long time. So my humble pranams to them for all their work that they've done on the subject. So on the book, that's a great question. I think I'll probably deal it with 3 buckets to your question. The first bucket is why the book on Kautilya. So, I've been fascinated from a younger age because we hear a lot about Chanakya. We hear, Chanakya Niti. We hear a lot about what he's done. So naturally, it fascinated me when I was young. When I was looking at the subject. But at some point of time, I was working on Angus Madison's data set on historical GDP in the world as part of my research. And I realized that, so I sort of, basically the crux of the research says that post first century 1 CE, that India and China have been sort of the leading countries in the world in terms of GDP till about the 17th century. My intuitive understanding was while production and industrial revolution didn't come through, there was still a lot of literature which talked about how India was supposed to be one of the most fascinating places for explorers and people alike because of the prosperity around. And my intuitive understanding was this was based on sort of a framework, an economic framework. And I referred to Kautilya for that. But surprisingly, when I looked at the text, I found very little on the Artha part of it, on the Arthashastra, for a variety of reasons. So you could find books on the Chanakya Niti aspect. You could find books on the political aspect. Dr. Pillai has written a lot of books on the motivational sort of business aspects. And then you could find books on fiction, but very little on economics, which is, which sort of fascinated me and also got me triggered into the subject. I still don't know the reason why there are literally very few books on economics. And so that sort of motivated me to do that. And why did it take a long time? I think it took a long time primarily because this book involves a sort of 3 sets of skill sets. First skill set is you need to understand the text, which is in dense Sanskritam, and you need to deal with experts to sort of filter the text and the nuances of the text. And then the second bucket is on economics and finance. You need to sort of extract all of that stuff from the text in a format that is understandable for us in today's times. And the third part is to create a framework, because the framework is something that's sort of new that I've sort of brought to the table. and that framework and conceptualizing that framework. So bringing all these three things together, I think, took a bit of time because you got to contextualize it for today's times as well. So I would say, these are the reasons why it took some time to do it, but hopefully it was worth the wait.
Yeah, and one of the things that comes out beautifully in this book is this. Almost, you can say, of course, they were years apart, but this kind of to and fro that you make and comparison that you make between Kautilya and Adam Smith. So one of the things that, the question that props up, and pardon my ignorance in economics, because the rest three of you are experts and I'm a layman in this. How far ahead was Kautilya compared to Adam Smith as far as the economic depth and the nuances are concerned? Because this is something that we've never been taught. The things that the revelations from this book concerning the fundamentals of economics itself for a layman are, really stunning and revealing. So, can we at one level compare Adam Smith with Kautilya, and who comes up front?
Yeah, that's a great question, right? Because one is whether can we compare.
Yeah.
Another question is what is the comparison, right? So on the first part of whether we can compare, there's a lot of different views on this subject, right? Some of us, like myself and Professor Balbir Sihag, for example, who's written a brilliant book on the same subject, feel that Kautilya is far ahead of his times. Professor Meghnad Desai, who's written a blurb for the book, actually disagrees in the sense he feels that Kautilya is his own person. He had his own sort of worldview, and Smith was completely different. He had a different context, different worldview, and they aren't compatible. But I think what comes across well, at least in the research and what I've done, is that a lot of these concepts which were used by Kautilya in different forms over a period of time, right? So those concepts in modern times has been far more refined, defined in, say, the academic mold in a form that is understandable to our modern parlance. But in Kautilya's times, I think those ideas did emanate. So just to give you an example of some of these ideas, just for the audience's sake, is some of these ideas which were discussed earlier compared to what it is now. So if you take concepts like opportunity cost, the main author was Wieser in 1889. Demand supply framework was written by Marshall in 1870. Marginal analysis was done by Turgot in 1766. Moral hazard by Adam Smith in 1776. Public goods by Lindahl and Samuelson. Things like efficiency wages by Marx and Solow, and things like asymmetric information by Ekerlof. A lot of these ideas, which I've just told you, by some of these great thinkers, was done by Kautilya as well in a different form. Professor Sihag's book deals a lot on the conceptual underpinning of it. I sort of mention it in some of the chapters. But answering your broad question, I think, in my personal view, they are comparable. Kautilya was indeed ahead of his times. His level of communication in modern lingo might not be as sort of coherent, but a lot of his ideas had conceptual underpinnings much, much ahead of Smith during his time. That is my sort of take from my research thus far.
Yeah, and I have a range of other questions, especially concerning the relevance of Kautilya and Kautilyanomics to the present economic policy making or system that we have in India right now, especially concerning Dharmic capitalism. And of course, one of the economic concepts that you also mentioned is nudge, so-called nudge economics, which is terribly fascinating for the layman. If Kautilya had mentioned that. But before I come to those questions, Sri, I would like to pass on the mic, if I may, in a manner of speaking, to Dr. Deodhar about his comments and any questions that he may have for you. Dr. Deodhar, over to you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Thanks for giving me this opportunity. Congratulations, Sriram. Wonderful book. And I think whether it's Dr. Pillai or Sihag, or I think we are all contributing in our own way And I hope one day it will become a big necklace, each pearl contributing to it. And because there's so much in the history and nobody has looked at it yet. And I think in that context, I really congratulate you for writing this book. Since you mentioned a few comments, since you mentioned, Anand asked about Adam Smith and Kautilya, right? Uh, Adam Smith had compartmentalized things. He wrote first Theory of Moral Sentiments. Then he writes, the other treatise in 1776. But Kautilya combines both. He gives an integrated view of dharma as well as economics, right? So I think that's where the beauty lies in Chanakya's contributions. And he was more of an empiricist, I think. And you may not find, theoretical statements coming out of it, but you will find practical implications of it in whatever he has written. So that's the distinction I would like to make, and which happened uh, 2000 years before Adam Smith. So I think that is very important. A gap of 2000 years is too much, and see, these ideas are already there. So that's, I think, really wonderful. So I compliment you. I think I'm glad you highlighted dharma as one of the principles. I'm glad that you talk about sustainable growth. I mean, things are coming into full circle now, right? When he defines economics, he's talking about using natural resources of the earth, right? Sustainably, and that's what he's defining economics. And today, this is what is being talked about: using the growth without damaging the environment. So I think these are all coming back to us, thought much ahead of time. No doubt about it. So I think sustainable growth. Dharma being given the preference over Artha and Kama. And of course, at one point in time, he says, Artha iva pradhan iti Kautilya, Artha mulo hi dharma kama viti. At one stage he says, no, but Artha is also important. That's what he's saying. So I think so these are important facets. In fact, if you look at the circular flow of income, land, labor, capital, entrepreneurship. This is what households are offering to the firms. And on each of these items, Kautilya has something to say. When you talk about labor, he's talking about labor unions.
Right.
Modern terminology, union is not used. It's not Karl Marx who talked about unionization. It's 2000 years prior to that. Kautilya is talking about it. You will call nigamas or you call the different names for it, right? So I think that's going ahead. You talk about land also. Ricardo talked about diminishing returns to land, right? About the corn laws. Kautilya is saying different kinds of taxation for different kinds of lands. More productive land will give you more taxation. I think so. These ideas were extremely important and coming so 2 millennia prior. So I'm glad that you have brought all these things together. And you talk about sovereign debt, and I was very happy to hear that you are talking about debt. Maybe I would like to know more about from you about the sovereign debt, what he was talking about. But I also know that he knew about deficit financing.
Yeah.
That you need to look at other historical texts. For example, if you look at the Buddhist literature in Mahavagga, there is a mention that how did Kautilya finance his war against the Magadha Empire? When he took Chandragupta Maurya with him, at that time he knew the technology of copper coins and silver coins, but gold was going out of circulation because it was being too expensive. So apparently he increased his finances from 1 crore to 8 crore, and there was a technology he knew where one could, of course, Mr. hired engineers, but to convert the copper coins and give plating to them and convert into silver coins. And that's how he increased the money supply from 1 crore to 8 crores.
Yeah.
So I think, he knew deficit financing as well. So I think I'll at this stage, not talk much about it. But since you talk about sovereign debt, I'd like to hear more from you on the sovereign debt aspects of Kautilya as well. And so, yeah, let me at this stage conclude and let somebody else take on the baton for now.
Yeah, before Sri answers Dr. Deodhar's question, can I just inject one small question of my own, which is, Sri, do you think Adam Smith knew of Kautilya?
I don't think so, in the sense, even if he knew, he probably did not give enough attribution. But I do agree with Professor Deodhar. I think there is so much stuff. That's why I keep repeating in the book, if you have seen, that for all you know, another 10 years, I might have a different interpretation of this, right? Because, for all the talk on Chanakya and Kautilya, there are just 3-4 major translations. One is from Shyama Sastri in 1915, another is from Kangle, 3 versions in 1960s, and then by Rangarajan in 1990, right? 3 translations for the most talked about, book in probably Indian contemporary socio-economic history, right? Which is
And
itself.
what is fascinating is, yes, as Dr. Deodhar said, that he was not a theorist, so a theoretician. Everything was empirical, so everything was tested, which is
Yes.
remarkable, which itself tells you 2,000 years ago how evolved the society must have been. If these were not mere theories, but these were basically gleaning from what actually happened all around him, it's quite remarkable, really.
Yeah, and just to add to Professor's point, see, even on the issue of labor contracts, right? Kautilya had the vision to say that transparency of labor contracts, even within the most lowest level of people, where he says that, the employer and the employee need to have a, transparent labor sort of system where the person doesn't pay or doesn't do work beyond a particular point, even though he's the lowest level of laborers. So the concept of minimum wage, he had multiple minimum wages for different sections of society. All this has a conceptual underpinning, right? I mean, that is what I think, this book tries to attempt, is to sort of go into Kautilya's head and extract everything into a framework. Because the problem is, I mean, the challenge with these texts is that's where we have I have a section on Tantra Yukti, which is a sort of a Sanskritam technique to sort of extract the text in its nascent form. I personally feel that the 3 translators, thus far 3 or 4 translators, still don't do enough justice because, they're not subject matter experts, right? So because you need a subject matter expert like probably Professor Deodhar to sort of look into this and get your subjects sort of meet, a sense out of it from the translation. So another challenge is is that Kautilya might have targeted to an audience who could understand it, and we can't understand his sort of structure, and to understand it in our sort of thinking today, we need to sort of extract it even more and refine it more and more. So my broader point is, I think there is still a lot of possibilities of explanations and different texts which sort of allude to this,
Which is great news, because then we're looking forward to a sequel and possibly uh, book
yeah, I
3
mean,
or book 4.
just to wrap this point up, Anand, you know the extent of Kautilya's work is so comprehensive or so extensive that even in Cambodia, where the Hindu empires were there, the Khmer and the Srivijaya empires, there are inscriptions in Cambodia which talk about the Arthashastra, where in Kambuj Desa there are mentions of the Arthashastra. So which means, for people even in the Common Era, beginning of Common Era and onwards, they had used this text at various forms to sort of, you know, run their civilizations per se. So
No, I mean, I suspect Adam Smith possibly knew of Kautilya, but didn't mention it because of, I don't know. It's like I don't know whether did Newton know of Brahmagupta? No one knows. But would you like to comment on one specific that Dr. Deodhar mentioned about the war economics or economics of war as far as Kautilya is concerned? Because that's a very important and
yeah,
pertinent topic.
that's a very important point. So that's why in that chapter, I sort of, you know, don't. I mean, I propose the idea of debt resolution, how he would do it for, say, through the Samadhama Bandha framework, and on the sovereign level, because the concept of a nation state was still sort of, I wouldn't say nascent, but it had a different contour to it. So I think that's an area where Professor Deodhar's point is very valid. I mean, the Buddhist inscriptions also allude to that, where he found various ways of financing, especially during war. See, another point that you need to note is that despite the continuity and prosperity of all these civilizations, they were at war literally all the time. right? Might be small wars, might be bigger wars, or whatever it is. But there was an undercurrent. You had, Chinese travelers, Greek travelers writing accounts about what is happening in all these places, which means that trade was still going through, despite the geopolitical climate. So he did find innovative ways of financing. And I think that's another area which I would probably explore in my subsequent work on the sovereign nature of it. I couldn't sort of do as much justice, but I do agree with Professor Deodhar's point. He did look at other forms of financing, how to make that sustainable, how to ensure you don't raise too much taxes. He says taxation should be like honey and nectar. So I do agree with Professor Deodhar on that point.
What is that curve that you economists talk about? Laffer curve, or that you must not increase the taxation too high? So I
That's right.
suppose there are some corrections on there. And the fact that you mentioned about the kind of very evolved thinking, in that even if you are having or undertaking many wars, the trade will still continue. I mean, I suppose at one level the parallel would be between us and China. And in spite of Galwan, our trade has only grown between China. So much for Atmanirbharta. So even at that point of time, I mean, we knew that one has to be sensible about it. Is that the
Yes.
point that you were making, Sri?
Yeah, the sense is there is a distinction between the politics and the economics, right?
Yeah,
I mean, though economics and politics are intertwined, Kautilya's view is that unless you have economic prosperity,
yeah,
the politics is not going to function, right? We hear a lot about the politics, but he had a sound, or he had his own understanding of economics, which made him, which was a foundation for his political success. And the foundation of economic success for him was dharma, and the idea of dharmic capitalism. So that is sort of the summary of one-line summary.
Which is a nice way to slip in Dr. Pillai. Hello, Dr. Pillai. Two questions that I may prompt you to, in fact, in turn ask you. One is on this so-called very fascinating phrase. Almost, I mean, I heard it for the first time reading Kautilyanomics, is dharmic capitalism. What, in your sense, is, I suppose we're all friends discussing it, is Sri's reading of it, and how effectively can that be used by modern economists and policymakers is what I'm really concerned.
Yeah. Thank you, Anand sir, for this wonderful question. Thank you, Deodhar sir, for being part of this discussion. And of course, the great author, man of the match, Sriram sir. First of all, thanks for sending across this book. I know today is a launch, and I got an opportunity to read every page. And I was waiting to give some inputs. So 3 takeaways before I answer your question, which stands out, and a unique contribution to the field of knowledge. The first, as you mentioned, answer is about dharmic capitalism, which I'll speak about it later. And the second part is that the way you have interpreted, the very famous shloka of Arthashastra, Praja Sukhe Sukham Rajyaha, Prajanam Cha Hite Hitam. So that is one thing which I feel you have contributed in the modern context. But the most fascinating part of the book for me was the chapter on post-pandemic application in real-life situation. So, we can debate and glorify the past. But Sriram takes it to the next level and saying that, can the world correct the economic system using Kautilya economics in the post-pandemic era? And you have given a lot of statistics, graphs, images, pictures to prove the point. So I would say it's a must read for all of us as scholars, as teachers, and also anybody who wants to know the basics. And as you rightly pointed out, Sriram sir, there are so many more books ready to come out from you as well. I look forward for the future books. Now, coming back to the question, Anand sir, about dharmic capitalism. Capitalism cannot be a one word. There are varieties of capitalism. There are American method and Indian method. I'm sure every country, every culture, every society will have its own model of capitalism. But in India, this first word, dharma, has been debated and discussed for centuries. In fact, dharma is the biggest, I think, debate and discussion point in every scripture of India. If you look at the Mahabharata, probably the biggest work ever on 1 lakh shlokas on Dharma Sankat, right from Yudhishthira to Bhishmacharya. And that's where Chanakya converts that into an economic model. And as Deodhar sir rightly pointed out, after going through all these things, Chanakya is very clear. The Arthasya Moolam Dharmaha. So finally, even for good work, for Dharmic work, you require Artha. So Chanakya is writing Arthashastra with the base of Dharma. Now coming back, my thoughts and of course reading some of the ideas given by Sriram, Dharmic capitalism is something very unique to India. It is not just capitalism. It's not just about making money or entrepreneurship. What is the kind of a foundation you have? So even Chanakya speaking on Artha, he is not forgetting the base of Dharma. So I would say that, I think we go back and this country had three forms of economic models. What we call the family economy, the temple economy and village economy. If you study the Arthashastra, you will find the combination of all these three. In India, even today, in the year 2022, most of us have a family culture. We earn for our families, not as individuals. So it's a family economics, there's a village economics. So I think everything was a village model. Of course, the temple economics. If you look at it, the modern day, we have the banks, the banking system. But thousands of years ago, the temples were the place where you kept all the reserves. So I think there is so much to write about your next book also, Sriram sir. But this book is absolutely a must read for everybody who wants to understand Chanakya, even if you are not an economist. So thank you so much. Over to you, Anand sir.
Yeah, no, thank you, Dr. Pillai. And also one of the things that you talked about, really, I mean, I lament, how shall I put it, the government control of the Hindu temples. 113,500 odd Hindu temples under the government control. You talked about how temples were at the center for running not only your family, but your villages and even larger and larger towns, maybe even cities, maybe even kingdoms. And one thing is exemplified from that is the fact that all that, millions of acres of temple land, which is currently under government control, and the government takes pittance as well, that could eventually actually fetch lakhs of crores, and that amount could be used by Hindus and temples, or through their temples, for a lot of public goods that other religions and their places of worship are using for the public good of their community. So, see, did Kautilya talk specifically about temples and the economy that is run by temples in Arthashastra?
Yeah, see,
Yeah. Sriram, yes, please continue.
yeah, see, I think leaving the sort of the politics aside, I think the fundamental idea of that sort of system is a decentralized economic system, in the sense you have, say, for a particular village, a particular ecosystem, say a particular institution like the temple, which sort of serves multiple purposes, right? And the idea really is that you sort of have a decentralized approach to governance and the economy. And I think Kautilya had a much the beauty of the Arthashastra is that it is context agnostic, in the sense that it is not meant for the Mauryan Empire. There's nowhere in the text does he say that he would want, or this is what was implemented. He is basically saying this is what I define as a set of principles, and this is it. I'm not giving you a context. I'm not giving you a sort of a scenario-based analysis. So I think the beauty there is, his worldview is sort of agnostic of the context with which he's there, though he's writing it in that context. But the text is not meant for a particular king or kingdom, right? So I think that's a fundamental difference between Kautilya and, say, Machiavelli, which is often a wrong comparison, because he doesn't write it for the king. He writes it for the welfare of the people, which is the primary focus of his entire text. So answering your question, I think he does make references to the idea of a decentralized economy, and the idea of though there is, in my view, there isn't direct too many references to specific temples and institutions, but the sense is there of Dharma being the foundation. Again, just to the point on what Dr. Pillai mentioned, this was another area which was sort of I had to carefully tread because, dharma is a very sensitive topic for all of us, right? I mean, it's a word that we use all the time, but it's a word that we find very difficult to define every single day. So, my definition of dharma or the idea of dharmic capitalism is into three big buckets of ethics, responsibilities, and sort of a global harmony sort of worldview. But there could be other definitions of dharma. But I feel that Kautilya sort of extracted these for his ideas. And the idea of capitalism itself, I mean, the reason why I had to mention it as dharmic capitalism is purely to lay the context and make a contextual comparison, right? We could have a more Arthashastra sort of an indigenous name by itself, the way Kautilya wanted to define it. So the reason why I kept it with the capitalism name is sort of to bring a contextual relevance for a common reader. Because another challenge with this book is how do you sort of bring all these ideas of history, Indology, economics, finance for a lay person who who just wants to get a perspective. I mean, there's a funny example of the book. There's a chapter on gold which I've written, and the first draft, once I wrote it, my wife, she's a PhD in biochemistry, Anand, by the way. But she read the chapter and she was like, it is too complex or for a common reader. So, and then I had to introduce a section on contemporary things on gold, including Kalyan jewelers and all these things, so that people can relate to the topic, right? So that was another challenge because you had to simplify it for the common reader, yet have the academic rigor which people like Professor Deodhar work day in, day out on. So that was the sort of another challenge. But anyway, so on that point, on dharma and its and its contours and the role of, say, temples and decentralized institutions, I think Kautilya was very much aware of it. But his texts make sure that there isn't specific mentions on all these things, but there's an undercurrent of dharma everywhere on whatever that he does.
If I may, I think there's a context to answer directly to your question on the temple economics. I think when Kautilya wrote his treatise, the Indian economy was in a transition. Vedic sacrifices and that rituals, they were on the wane, and Puranic stories were about to come in the Gupta period. And Kautilya is writing right in the middle of this thing. And therefore, there is not too much discussion of temples, but it's mostly about welfare is a three-dimensional thing. You have Purusharthas, you have Varnas, and you have Ashramas. It's a combination of 4 by 4 by 4. The 64 combinations are there. And that's how you are defining welfare for each individual. Everybody goes through 4 Purusharthas, you go through 4 Ashramas, and you choose your occupations of 4 Varnas. Today I can be Vaishya, tomorrow I can be Shudra, day after, because I also go through different stages of life, right? So the welfare was a three-dimensional thing, and temple economy was not much discussed because, as I say, it was at the cusp of waning of the ritual and beginning of the Puranic tradition. That's where I think Kautilya comes.
Yeah, if I can, opportune time to spice it up a bit, because let me ask the 3 panelists, including Sri here, to give concrete examples of, let's say, 1 or 2 policies that the current government has implemented or is following. That is not what Kautilya would have recommended, or that is not following dharmic capitalism. So let me start by asking this question to Dr. Deodhar and then Dr. Pillai, and then let me come back to Sri.
Probably I'll give you the counter examples, which are in line with what he is doing. I think let's put it positively.
Let that come later. A couple of examples which the government should be following, but is not.
Right. I think one thing comes to my mind is the pay commissions. We have pay commission, but they have been influenced by a little bit of socialistic ideas. And therefore, the band, the lowest of the lowest salary and the highest salary, that gap is not as much. But if you look at, I'm glad that Sriram has given the table where the palanquin bearer will get 60 panas and the Purohita or the advisor gets 48,000 panas. So there's a wide spectrum of salaries, and that is linked to productivity. And in the pay commissions must also pay attention to this. If you don't have too much wide variation, then there is an incentive you are giving for moonlighting. You know, so I think that's one lesson that I think pay commission should also learn from this, and
But
that's
if
one
the government
thing.
listens to this broadcast, I've just made sure that it will never induct Dr. Deodhar as one of the panelists there in the pay commission. But any other example you can think of, Dr. Deodhar?
Well, I think pay commission. I could think when I was reading the book, I thought of this. The other one is about GST, right? I remember reading in the book. There are two, I think, tax rates. One is for imports and one is for domestic industry. Only two rates: 5%, 10%, maybe one more. I don't know, but just three tax rates. And in GST, they are saying one nation, one tax, one rate. There should be just one rate. If there's proliferation of rates, then there's office people are trying to obfuscate, try to move from one category to another category, try to influence the bureaucrats and move from one category to the lower category. All this directly unproductive activity starts. So I think there should be just what Kautilya is suggesting, 5%, 10%, just one GST rate, 10%, irrespective of the industry. And things will be much more simpler. Tax collection will also go up and administration is so much easier. Maybe I think we should move to that philosophy also.
Fantastic. Before I move on to the questions that the audience have asked, Dr. Pillai, a couple of policies that the government should be following Kautilya's but isn't.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Anand sir. So, you mentioned, and Sriram sir was also talking about war economics.
Yeah.
So when you look at Dharmic capitalism, we always have Dharma Yuddha.
Mm-hmm.
So it is not just war for the sake of economics, but war for the sake of Dharma. Coming back to two government policies, which probably can be considered for our generation. The first one actually is the pension for spies.
Mm-hmm.
See, the spies or the espionage system has a major problem. And they are not directly on the payroll, but they are the ones who are inside the enemy's camp, risking their lives, families, and Chanakya takes care of them. In fact, there is a word in the Arthashastra, I'm not able to recollect. It is people who are on dual payments. So they are paid by your country and they are paid by the enemy because the enemy thinks they are working for them. So Chanakya will protect them in both sides. Very important policy.
You think this is not happening in the current regime?
So again, these are all, as you say, insiders. So we'll have to do a little bit of research. But Chanakya definitely ensures if there is a policy, great. But he makes it a formal policy. The second one, I just take Dr. Deodhar's example forward. It is about salaries and pensions, even for women. Today we talk about women empowerment, but 2,400 years ago we had salaries defined not only for the king but also for the queen. Even the organized sector, which we loosely call as courtesans, after a certain age, they were also taxed. They were guaranteed pensions forever. So in your productive times and the not so productive times, you are a citizen of the country. So the economic model that he has, from salary to pension to taking care of the family, and there were also tax holidays. There are so many things that we can go back. But again, as Sriram sir always says, it's very contextual. You have to go back, debate, discuss, and make it relevant. Like in his book, how do we apply to the post-pandemic era? Thank you, Anand sir. Over to you.
Thank you. Can I start with I will intersperse any comments that Dr. Deodhar and Dr. Pillai may have in between the questions. So let me kick off with one question, Sri, that is asked by Ankit Khandelwal. It says, can you help us with some examples which can explain the evolution of trade, especially in the Indian subcontinent?
Yeah, of course. See, in the chapter of trade in the book, I sort of elaborate a bit on this. The idea of trade routes in ancient India, right? I mean, the Dakshina path and Uttara path, an example. You had, if people have read the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, which is a fantastic book of a voyager who sort of went across continents, you would find that, and also Greek inscriptions, Chinese embassy inscriptions, you would find that trade was very, very, globalization was, was a pre, CE phenomena. You know, in fact, the idea of global trade was one of the very consistent things across the common era and even before, because of purely the various accounts of, various people who've traveled in various spaces. You could find spices, you could find clothing, you could find all these kind of contemporary normal Aam Aadmi consumption items that we define today were all, combination of imports and exports. So, in fact, Kautilya incentivizes a lot of imports, more than, the domestic sort of capacity, domestic production. He gives extra protection for imports. He gives, additional caravans for transportations across the empire, for imports, and he also gives tax exemptions for imports, right? So the idea of trade was, very sort of inherent in both the psyche as well as the economic philosophy during Kautilya's time. So I think over a period of time, it evolved from internal trade between countries, I mean, within the country, and also maritime trade. Sanjeev ji has written a brilliant book on maritime routes. These maritime routes were, where the heart of international trade. So, answering a question, the reader's question, I think there has been a certain evolution of trade, but at a conceptual level, I think, people were, even in those times, convinced that a global world is something that is not to be afraid of, or, having an anathema towards, but it's something that one should embrace, or and to sort of prosper.
Sri, both of us have the same copies. I hope we have the same copies, so we'll have the same page numbers. Can you go to page 197 and inform our public about something that we seem to be currently beset with? It is a problem that is wrecking our economy and wrecking our policymakers. It's on page 197 of your book. Can you read? Can you take that book which is behind you?
Sure, Anand. Is it possible to just give me what the text is so that I can?
It's on. Okay, well, I'll disclose it. I wanted it to be a secret and come out of yours but it's about non-performing assets.
Right.
And Kautilya talked about that as well. So, this is something that we heard about, in fact, a couple of weeks ago, that the opposition went hammer and tongs against the government, saying that, look, it has waived off 10 lakh crores of capitalists and non-performing. In fact, it had written off. So there was a difference between waiving off and writing off. But it is astonishing to me while reading it that, Kautilya had very strong views about non-performing agreements.
Yeah. So
even that point. Yeah.
That's right. I mean, that's a very important point. So that's the thing. I mean, though the complexity of the economy weren't as complex as today's times, but also information was as asymmetric as today's. I mean, it was not as symmetric as today, which means you had a lack of information, mobility of information. So it was complex in that sense. But on your point on the NPAs, he takes a strong position that these non-performance agreements. So that's where I think I'm talking about a state which is strong, but not necessarily prescriptive, right? So it ensures that there is transparency of agreements. It ensures that responsibilities and rights are given to people at the lowest end of the spectrum.
Correct.
But if you violate these agreements, the punishment is quite severe. So the same goes for the corporate sector or the private sector, which Kautilya talks about, because he says that I will give you all these sort of incentives, all the structures in place for you to do your business, and I'll also enable financing through whatever that's means possible. But if you're going to violate some of these agreements, then I would take a much more stronger stance against you and be a more, a state which sort of delivers on taking these people to book. So I think that's what the court sort of, I mean, in a very simple language, that's what it tries to. I think that was his view, that
Yes.
even for the private sector, there had to be a sort of a dharma within, their functioning. That if they cross the line, then he would impose the regulations in an effective manner.
Yeah. There is another question by Mr. Shiv Bhatia. What are some parallels between Kautilya's model of a capitalist welfare economics and today's model of a so-called mixed economy we've tried following in India? How can we ensure that our present-day institutions operate with the same efficiency as envisioned in Arthashastra? Very interesting question.
Yeah, that's a very pertinent question, right? Welfare is an issue today. It is an issue probably when humanity started itself, because welfare is at the root of prosperity of people. I think Kautilya believed in sort of a targeted welfare, right? He didn't believe in sort of doles for everyone, right? He believed, in my view, that the people who actually needed it, you had to provide them support, and gradation of support, meaning people highly need based, and the need is also gradated over a particular gradient, which sort of for his welfare needs. So I think his idea of welfarism was to enable the individual, give all kinds of mechanisms, empower the individual to prosper, and at the same time, for people, for a variety of reasons, if they have a background which doesn't enable them to sort of grow, provide them temporary support through some of these schemes, so that it's sort of so that's sort of an approach he had, I would say, on welfare, and on the idea of
Sorry.
what some of the things could be applicable is the idea of dharmic nudges, which I speak about, right? I mean,
In fact, that was going to be my next question, because a lot of welfare nowadays, welfare economics, is being intertwined with so-called nudge economics. And as you know, I mean, as a layman, that the whole concept, even though I knew, but not as the phrase nudge economics, and until it won the Reichsbank's prize, or what people call Nobel, in 2017. So, how advanced was Kautilya's thinking about nudge economics?
I think, see, the entire idea of dharma as a foundation is nudge in itself, in the sense that he was shrewd enough to understand that every economic choice, right, every activity that you or I make, right, when you're going to buy, let's say you're buying a laptop, that is an economic purchase that you're making. That purchase or that economic activity, combined with, say, millions and billions of people doing millions and billions of transactions, eventually aggregates to form the macroeconomy, right? But the fundamental choice of you making a purchase of a particular, say, laptop, is defined by your own instinctive choice, a behavioral choice, right? So a behavioral choice can be through a variety of factors. But I think for us Indians, especially living, I think that behavioral choice is defined to an extent by our cultural sort of upbringing, and our sort of cultural framework that sort of defines those choices or plays a role of those choices, right? So when you're intertwining dharmic nudges to the system, then what you're trying to do is to sort of go to the root of it, and then defining your choices. So take the idea of Swachh Bharat, right? I mean, forget the politics of Swachh Bharat, okay? If you really look at the concept of Swachh Bharat, it's a brilliant concept.
It is.
It caters to your dharmic instinct of Saucham, which is essentially the cleanliness that we do in our day-to-day lives. Every day in villages in South India and Tamil Nadu, even in Chennai, in the morning, we clean everything, we put a column, we embrace our upbringing, through cleanliness. So,
And in fact, scientific studies, sorry to interrupt you, you're absolutely right. Scientific studies have shown, in fact, there's a peer-reviewed paper that came out, that every toilet given to a household has saved that household 52,000 rupees, in terms of health costs, in terms of, standard of living and all those sorts of things that the families would suffer because they didn't have a toilet. And I mean, one of the shining examples of, I suppose, nudge economics would be Ujjwala. You give away a couple of cylinders free, and then
Yes.
you push the family towards. It's really. Can I at this point also announce the book winners? Ankit Khandelwal, Shiv Bhatia, and Harsh Agarwal. Congratulations to all three of you. Before we leave, because we're running out of time, I'm so sorry. We could have gone on for hours, Sri. But a finance minister will last, they say, only as long as the prime minister wants him or her to. Of course, we've seen that example in the UK gloriously, but where the finance minister wants to be a prime minister, but that's another one. But how long do you think Kautilya would have lasted as a finance minister in Mr. PM Modi's regime? Honest answer from you, Sri.
yeah, as always, you ask these tricky questions, Anand. But taking, one of the reasons I think Kautilya made this context agnostic, because he's probably also aware of the practical realities of day-to-day governance, right? So he didn't sort of make this as a budget document for the Mauryan Empire. So he was shrewd enough even then to understand the complexity of governance. But I think
he would have lasted 5 years under PM Modi.
That is, I leave that to your imagination. But my
no, I want to pin you down on this, because I mean, on a serious note, I think PM Modi, I would like to believe that he listens to his critics, and if at all you can call Kautilya a critic. I mean, he's something who's a visionary, and visionaries are not critics because they're looking ahead, possibly for the first time. So I suppose in many ways Modi would have learned a lot from Kautilya. But then again, some of the the policies and the theories that are suggested are so novel and so path breaking that maybe I suppose the point I'm getting at is that was he ahead of his time?
Yeah, of course, because see, the question really is, that's where the introductory chapter sort of alludes to this entire question, because a lot of Kautilya's ideas were ideas which came from the Ramayana, Mahabharata, and a lot of prior scriptures, right? So I think as a civilization, in terms of ideas, we're all far ahead of our times in various of these instances. And what Kautilya does is he sort of understood the essence of prosperity as key for future sort of progress and growth. And I think that is the takeaway which I want from a lay reader reading this book, is that we're not saying that Kautilya is the answer to all of today's ills. Obviously not, right? What we're trying to say is that here is a guy, a thinker, who had a vision, who had a conceptual framework, which is debatable and on par with some of his contemporaries in more recent times. And he deserves credit for that. And more than that, there are some ideas which are still, can be included and incorporated in policy to using some of these techniques which Kautilya used. Not all of them, but some of them. So even if you sort of take one or two of them, it could have an important impact in the future as well. So I think the takeaway, just my last point, is that the takeaway, the main purpose of this book is to get this idea on the table. I would be more than happy if 10 books comes and critiques this book, and there are 10, 15 more books coming up. But the idea is to really get a book which has an analytical rigor that brings together all these ideas for the contemporary audience to sort of discuss and debate, and then for their own merit and advantage.
Anand, may I take your gauntlet?
Please. please.
Since you talked about whether he would be for finance minister for 5 years or more, I think I have a different take on that. In fact, if you read the Sanskrit play Mudra Rakshas, what Kautilya was trying to make sure was that the Mauryan king, Chandragupta Maurya, will get the right minister. It was the Rakshasa.
Right.
So he was scheming to make sure that Rakshasa will become his minister. So he wanted to give the theoretical underpinnings or empirical underpinnings, but let somebody else be the finance minister, right? I think
Right.
that is how I would look at it.
So he's not the Nirmala Sitaraman, but Amit Shah of those.
Yes, or some other non-social organization sitting outside.
On that wonderful note, I know we could have gone on for hours, but we're being reminded that we're totally out of time. On that note, can I please thank Dr. Deodhar and Dr. Pillai, and of course Sri, for this absolutely wonderful discussion. As I said, that could have lasted more than hours, more than an hour. And can I please recommend, I cannot recommend this book more highly, Kautilyanomics. Everyone, please, especially lay people like me, who have more than a passing interest in economics and the current mode of policy making, and would like to know how, things that were talked about thousands of years ago, as Dr. Deodhar said, 2000 years ago, are still more than relevant today, and in fact should be more relevant today than they are. So on that note, thank you so much, Sri. Yeah, you would like to make a comment before?
Yeah, thanks to everyone, to Dr. Pillai, to Dr. Deodhar, and of course Anand, for this wonderful discussion. I'm very grateful for all the scholars who worked on this subject, and I'm also grateful to the audience. Though these were my personal views, I think it sort of brought a flavor to the discussion. I do hope many more books, come across on the subject, and thanks to one and all, and also to Arth for facilitating this, for Kopal and team. I mean, they've been wonderful, and I'm really grateful for the support.
Thank you so much. A real pleasure.
Thank you.
Moderating. Thank you.
Good, congrats.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thanks.